Okay, let's finish up the bottom of page 2. Um, so Michael Pollan says, um, focus, where's the focusing? There we go. Okay. The steak dinner in question took place the evening before steer number 534's slaughter, the one event in his life I was not allowed to witness or learn anything about, uh, save its likely date. So he actually doesn't know when he's involved in the food industry, but they didn't actually tell him. This didn't surprise me. The meat industry understands that the more people know about what happens on the kill floor, that's where they kill the animals who are going to be food, the less meat they're likely to eat. So the meat industry, the people who make meat, try to hide from people the details of how that meat is killed. People don't want to think about it because the meat industry, which kills cattle, kills cows and kills pigs, and then turns them into beef and pork and sells them to you, doesn't want you to think about the animals being killed. Because if you thought about it, you might not eat meat, and then the company would lose money, and they don't want to lose money. So, um, cool. He says the less meat they're likely to eat. That's not because slaughter is necessarily inhumane, but because most of us would simply rather not be reminded of exactly what meat is or what it takes to bring it to our plates. My steak dinner, eaten in the company of the world's leading philosopher of animal rights, that's the guy that wrote the book that he's reading, represented my somewhat tortured attempt to mark the occasion, and to try, a bit belatedly, I know, meaning late, to see if I could defend what I had done already and what I was about to do. So he says he's trying to think about, he's eating a steak and reading this book about why you shouldn't eat meat. Because he's like, remember David Foster Wallace says, if you eat meat, how do you make moral sense of that? Like, what story do you tell yourself about the meat that makes it okay to kill an animal in order to just for entertainment purposes? Because you could just eat plants, which means if you don't have to eat it, then it's entertainment. It's just something you enjoy. Um, Michael Pollan is dealing with the same issue David Foster Wallace is dealing with, which is he's eating a steak and reading a book about animal rights because he's trying to think to himself, how do I? And a cattle he owns is a cow he owns is going to be killed tomorrow. So he's like, how do I justify this? How do I make sense of it in terms of morals? I realize some of this is quite crazy to think about. Partly, and this has been true of Phaedrus from the beginning, is it raises a lot of moral questions about what is right and what is wrong, what is good to do and what is bad to do. And most people will go their entire lives without ever thinking about those questions. They just go, whatever, I eat meat, I like it, and they don't think about whether it's like morally okay, because most people don't consider ethical problems. But you went to college and you ended up in my class, and now we're thinking about ethical problems. So you're sort of stuck with it. Um, okay, cool. Now Michael Pollan goes on. But the whole point of this class, and really a college education in general, is to raise questions that most people don't ever think about. You are in a special position to think about complex social issues in kind of a big way. Because most people will go their whole lives and they'll never ask themselves these questions. I think that it makes you a bigger person to consider these issues. No matter what you decide, whatever you decide to do, I'm not here to tell you don't eat meat. Hell, I eat meat. But I think if you're thinking about these issues, like Socrates wants you to think about issues, I think it sort of enlarges you. It enlarges Socrates would say, your soul, your psyche, your mind. You're bigger as a result of thinking about these issues. By the way, notice I didn't say better. Thinking hard doesn't make people good or bad. Lots of people are stupid, are very kind and good people. So thinking, it makes you bigger. It doesn't, a lot of people are like education makes you better. Well, I don't know if it does. The Nazis, for example, were extremely well educated and didn't stop them from murdering 6 million innocent people. So, education doesn't, I don't think it does make you better, but it makes you bigger. And I think that's also valuable. All right, let's take a look. So here we go. He says, eating meat has become morally problematic, at least for people who take the trouble to think about it, right? If you think about it, it's trouble. Vegetarianism is more popular than it ever has been. And animal rights, the fringest of fringe movements just a few years ago, meaning it was like way on the edge and very few people did it. Animal rights is rapidly finding a way into the cultural mainstream. So animal rights used to be something only a handful of people did, but now more people are talking about it. I'm not completely sure why this should be happening now, given that humans have been eating animals for tens of thousands of years without much ethical heartburn, meaning like ethical problems. Certainly, there have been dissenters over the years. Ovid, St. Francis, Tolstoy, and Gandhi come to mind. So he's listing off some famous people that don't eat meat. Um, Ovid, by the way, I don't think we need to know who all these people are. Although you don't need to know who these people are for the exam. Ovid is a poet, an ancient poet who matters a lot to me. He's an ancient Roman poet, and he wrote a lot of when you think about like the mythology involving like Cupid and Aphrodite and Phoebus, the sun god, and Persephone and Mars, god of war. A lot of that's coming out of Ovid. Ovid wrote a whole book called the Metamorphoses, I should say, which is about gods and human beings who are magically transformed into animals. What's interesting about that is that at the end of the book, he has Pythagoras, who's an ancient philosopher who was from before Socrates' time. And Pythagoras, you guys know him from the Pythagorean theorem from math class, but he was a philosopher like Socrates. And Pythagoras was a vegetarian for a really interesting reason. Pythagoras traveled to India. This is the guy from the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That guy did other shit. But Pythagoras, he traveled to India, and he learned about reincarnation. The idea that when you die, your soul goes into another body. And he thought that a lot of people became animals. Like when you died, you could be reborn as a cow. And so he didn't eat meat because he felt like he was eating the souls of people. Interesting little fact about and the Metamorphosis, which is a book about humans and gods who are transformed into animals, suggests that you also shouldn't eat meat because any meat that you eat could be a god in disguise or could be a human being who has been cursed. So just that was Ovid. Saint Francis is an ancient Christian saint who was very kind to animals. If you've ever seen a picture of a saint surrounded by birds and animals like Snow White, that's Saint Francis. Saint Francis of Assisi. There's churches and things named after him. Tolstoy wrote a giant book called War and Peace. I'm not a big fan of Russian novels, so I don't really know a lot about Tolstoy, but he was a vegetarian. And Gandhi, who was a sort of famous activist from India who was against the British occupation of India, and Gandhi was a vegetarian, as a lot of people in India are vegetarians. So these are sort of four. This Gandhi's a little bit like Martin Luther King in India, and Tolstoy was a novelist, and Saint Francis was a saint, and Ovid was an ancient poet. So I'm not going to be tested on that, but I think it's worth knowing those famous names. All right. The general consensus has always been that humans were indeed carnivores, and whatever spiritual or moral dilemmas the killing and eating of animals posed, our various cultural traditions, everything from the rituals governing slaughter to saying grace before the meal, resolved them for us well enough. So, there were people who thought, again, like Ovid and Gandhi and Tolstoy and Pythagoras and St. Francis, who thought don't eat animals. But for most people, as long as you sort of do a little prayer before the meal or don't eat certain kinds of animals or fast once a year or whatever your cultural rules are for eating animals, most people are like, yeah, it's fine as long as you do it like this. In Jewish tradition, animals, for example, have to be killed in a certain way. It's supposed to be a humane way. So again, people have rules. They're like, look, as long as we follow these rules, it's fine to eat animals, right? Don't eat cats, right? Don't kick the animal to death. Say a prayer before you eat. You're fine. But he says, Michael Pollan points out, a lot of people now are starting to think more about, being vegetarian. Okay. For the most part, our culture has been telling us for millennia that animals were both good to eat and good to think. Right? It was totally fine. Animals were both good to eat and good to think. Right? So it's actually, I'm not sure what good to think means there. That's confusing. But the point is that people have been saying for years that animals are good to eat and that it's totally fine. And that sort of culturally we've been let off the hook. But so there used to be a handful of very intense, crazy people like Pythagoras and Ovid and Tolstoy and Gandhi and St. Francis of Assisi who were against eating meat. But most people are fine with it. But now more people are starting to sound like Ovid and Tolstoy and Gandhi and David Foster Wallace, who are asking big questions about, is it okay to eat meat? And that is the end of this video. I'll see you in the next one.